Darksiders 3 is an excellent example, and now case study of how mechanical systems in games all work together to a game's benefit or detriment, and how a change to simply one mechanic, even just a buff to some numbers, can have a cascading effect on the game as a whole. In this case, in my opinion, improving the game immeasurably, from one I could hesitantly recommend with a caveat, to one I can wholeheartedly endorse to anyone who likes the series, style, or inspirations of the game. Darksiders 3 was released on November 27, 2018, and it had its first major update on December 3, 2018. It was this update that so drastically changed the quality of the game and thus turned me into a staunch supporter of it. To dissect the design choices made in the switch from Darksiders 2 to 3, and between 3 and its influences, is enough for a video in itself. But for now, we'll begin by laying out some of the problems that the game had on its initial launch. In the background, I'll be showing footage of the game both before and after the major update. To preface, I feel compelled to mention that I chose to play Darksiders 3 on the hardest available difficulty, Apocalypse. I believe that a lot of a game's ugliest systems and worst problems become far clearer when everything is cranked up to 11. Now with that out of the way, on to the rest. Darksiders 3 is a third-person action-adventure game that takes cues from God of War, Legend of Zelda, and this time Dark Souls, to just name a few. In this game you play as Fury, one of the four horsemen of the Apocalypse. Fury uses a macabre-looking barbed and serrated whip, along with elemental secondary weapons such as nunchucks, a glaive, hammer, and two fiendish-looking swords. Players can chain together attacks from the different weapons, utilizing the unique movesets of each weapon to perform various combos that can leave enemies face down in the dirt, flailing in the air, and flat on their back, sometimes in rapid succession. The Darksiders games include puzzle-solving sections as well as their combo-based combat system. Generally speaking, enemies reside in the spaces between puzzles, or sometimes within puzzles in order to open a door, obtain a key, or otherwise inject a sudden spur of action into the more thoughtful mental challenges. Contrary to this methodology, this installment in the series is mostly comprised of combat punctuated by puzzles, whereas the first two titles in the series were more balanced on the puzzle versus combat spread overall. Since combat is so much more present in this game, it is by far one of the most important things to get right. It was not, at least on release, and there are around 5 or so major points that need to be dissected before we can look into the updated version. Number 1. Combat in Darksiders 3 follows a relatively frantic pace, allowing for slower, more methodical fights, but overall encourages a more aggressive playstyle. In truth, Darksiders 3 is more comparable to the original Darksiders rather than Darksiders 2, at least with its overall game feel. That said, the first game in the series had options for both blocking and dodging, while the newest installment has opted for exclusively dodging. The dodging, unfortunately, was not very good. If dodging gave invincibility frames, or exact moments where the character cannot take damage, then they were few and hard to see. Trying to distinguish if Fury avoided damage at the start, middle, or end of the dodge was incredibly difficult. Number 2. The hitboxes on enemy attacks are either laughable or infuriating, depending on how many times you've died to an attack that landed a full body distance away from you. The visual representation of many enemy attacks are only loosely connected to the actual areas that count as a hit. Moves that look like they can be dodged by jumping into the air lead to taking considerable damage, and trying to stick to a boss's blind spot leads to being blindsided by moves hitting Fury before their weapon even reaches you. Number 3. Enemies do not attack at you, they attack you. This distinction is hard to put into words, but it is very noticeable in practice. It is the difference between an enemy performing an animation and being locked into that animation in that direction, allowing the player to have some options, either move back, dodge into the attack, or run away from the attack, versus the enemy rotating along with you, or worse still, taking a surprise few steps as you try to dodge away. It feels more like the enemy is able to move on Fury until the moment that their attack is finished, rather than when it starts. For Soulsborne fans, this is the difference between Dark Souls 1 and 3 versus Dark Souls 2 when it comes to enemies following you during combat. Number 4. Darksiders 3 still has a combo-oriented combat style. Fury is able to chain together attacks with different weapons and using different movesets with specific weapons. But because of this, and various other reasons, some attacks take longer to complete. In previous games, primarily Darksiders 2, this wasn't as much of a problem because most, if not all, attacks could have their animations cancelled by dodging, stopping the attack but getting the player out of harm's way. This is not the case in 3. Some attack animations can be stopped early, but certainly not all, and typically, they can only be cancelled at the very start, which is usually 1/4 or 1/3 of the total animation time. Number 5. Enemy animations suffer from the opposite issue. They can be cancelled by the player if the enemy staggers given the right circumstances, but that's a mess for another time. The larger problem at play is the lack of telegraphing on enemy attacks. In games similar to Darksiders 3 and even its own predecessors, enemies gave ample indication of incoming attacks. There are, of course, exemptions wherein enemies give barely any telegraph, but in Darksiders 3, the norm and exceptions seem to have flipped. Foes will slip from a walking animation into a lunge with seemingly no windup or flare. At times, it even feels like Fury has longer pre-attack animations than some of the enemies and bosses she faces off against. All of these issues compound with each other to make combat at best an uphill battle, and at worst a miserable slog through a game that gives the impression that it doesn't want to be beaten. But then the December 3rd update happened, and along with some minor bug fixes and a quality of life improvement or two, one major change was made to the combat of Darksiders 3. The dodge was improved. More invincibility frames, better timing on those frames, and a larger window for perfect dodges. It was a change that didn't solve the other problems listed, but mitigated them to a point where the game was more enjoyable and felt fairer than it did on release. To go back through each point, number 1 kind of speaks for itself because the dodge was improved. Number 2, hitboxes are still all over the place, but now the player can dodge more preemptively, anticipating the incoming hit and being able to time the dodge more generously, rather than having to try to precisely time a dodge so narrowly with the visuals of the hit that the hitbox was able to smack Fury an exact moment before you felt the need to dodge. Number 3. Enemies locking onto Fury now have the counter of multiple consecutive dodges. Where before anything other than a near perfectly timed dodge would likely lead to taking damage, now it is relatively safe to chain together 2 dodges, or make use of the improved windows and aim for a perfect dodge. Number 4. A bigger window of invincibility while dodging allows for both preemptive and sudden dodges to be more often successful. While some combos still do require some commitment, it no longer feels like a 3 or 4 hit combo will lead to trading blows between Fury and her target. That said, being overwhelmed still requires a careful eye and a patient trigger finger. Number 5. With a clearer invincibility window, players now also benefit from liberally predicting enemy attacks, without oftentimes leaving themselves exposed. Before, a wrong dodge was as bad as no dodge at all, but with the changes, a player could take up a more defensive playstyle and focus on rapid, repeated dodges that don't leave them in as bad of a spot as if they tried to force their way through the damage. Ultimately, every aspect of combat in Darksiders was improved by giving the player a more effective dodge and thusly more confidence in dodging as an action. Combat transformed from a fight against the game into an elaborate back-and-forth puzzle with the game, and that is an important distinction. All this to say, the altering of one piece of the game's mechanical systems ended up influencing the entire game in whatever type of system received the change. The puzzle-solving aspects of Darksiders 3 remained relatively unchanged from the update, but the combat was drastically changed and improved from its release. Many players found the fights too difficult, the bosses too hard, the hitboxes too bloated, or Fury just too slow. Players on all difficulties were left frustrated and wanting a better experience from the game. But the design team didn't give universal buffs to Fury or nerfs to the enemies and bosses. Instead, they looked for, and successfully found, one individual mechanic that could be tweaked with maximum results. That one alteration had a cascading effect that bled into every part of combat that all manner of players were having trouble with. Remember, no matter your playstyle, in Darksiders 3 you have to dodge. This wasn't a change made to a specific gameplay style, this change was to the gameplay itself. Before we end, I want to address some minor points that might get brought up. Mainly that the update also improved some of the attack indicators or animation tells on certain enemies, as well as the fact that there is an in-game way to improve Fury's dodge window. While both of these are accurate points, not all enemies received the improved tells, and some that arguably needed it the most remain unaffected, namely some enemies towards the beginning of the game. Additionally, the dodge window buff for Fury is not readily available until a good portion of the game has been completed. Both of these counterpoints are true, but do not heavily alter the experience of someone only just picking up Darksiders 3, and it is those first minutes and hours of gameplay that shape the expectation for the rest of the game. So in the end, I don't believe that these counterpoints detract anything substantial from the main crux of what I've been saying, but I would be remiss to exclude them from mention. Anyways, I digress. I hope this video is able to properly convey the complexity and interconnectedness of mechanical systems and how making a very small change can have sweeping beneficial effects for the game as a whole. Thank you very much for watching and enjoy the rest of your day.